Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's my delight to have you here. I'm David Scobie, the Dean of the New School for Public Engagement, one of 7 divisions at the New School. The public in our name, like the public in New York Public Library, means many different things. I think one of the really important meanings for both our sponsoring institutions is the opportunity to convene the metropolitan public to listen to and talk about important matters of public import, public culture, public affairs. It's part of the DNA of our division. We're the founding division of the New School to play that convening role, and I'm delighted that we're still doing it. It's often, if not the very first time we've worked with the New York Public Library and the Cullman Center, the first time since I came to the New School, and I am delighted that we have the opportunity to partner with the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers to support and host this discussion tonight. Our partner is Jean Strauss, the director of the Cullman Center, and let me welcome her to the stage and welcome you to this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and everyone here. It is the first time since I've been at the Cullman Center that we've collaborated like this, but I hope it won't be the last. It's great to have so many people here, and I want to thank a number of other people, but mainly I came down, I typed out my remarks and raced down here and forgot them. So I, above all, want to thank someone who works with me, who isn't here now because he hasn't gotten back yet, but he raced up to the library, emailed me my remarks, so I'm going to read them to you off my iPhone. This is a first. Oh, there he is, Paul. Thank you so much. So, many thanks to be given out. I want to welcome you all to the first in what is in the series of the fall 2012 Conversations from the Cullman Center, and this is Conversations from the Cullman Center at the New School. We're really delighted to be co-sponsoring this, and I do hope that we'll be doing more. Thanks also to Pam Tillis, who made everything work extremely smoothly here tonight at the New School, and to the members of my Cullman Center staff, Marie Dorigny and Paul Delaverdac, and also to Patrick Knisley and Lisa from 192 Books, who will be selling books by both of tonight's speakers after they finish talking. They'll speak for about 45 minutes, then there will be a question and answer period, and then they'll sign books. Because we're filming this event, please, when you have questions, go up to the 2 microphones on either side of the room so that the speakers can see you and hear you, and the camera can as well. We have one other program that has a connection to the New School coming up on October 11th. The New School philosophy professor Simon Critchley will be talking with former Cullman Center fellow John Tresch, a historian of science at Penn, about Tresch's new book, The Romantic Machine, Utopian Science and Technology After Napoleon. You'll find cards with this information just outside the doors to this room, and then also this card, which has all of our programs on it for the fall lineup. They'll tell you how to make reservations, and if you'd like to be on our email list for getting online notifications of our programs, there's a sign-up sheet outside, just outside the door as well. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome tonight's 2 speakers, both of them former fellows at the Cullman Center. Ian Buruma, the Henry R. Luce Professor of Democracy, Human Rights, and Journalism at Bard College, was educated in Holland and Japan, where he studied history, Chinese literature, and Japanese cinema. Having been a journalist, a photographer, and filmmaker, reported from all over Asia, he now writes regularly for the New York Review of Books, The New Yorker, The New York Times, Corriere della Sera, and NRC Handelsblatt. His books include Taming the Gods, Religion and Democracy on 3 Continents, and The Wages of Guilt, Memories of War in Germany and in Japan, and Murder in Amsterdam, The Death of Theo van Gogh and the Limits of Tolerance. Ian has won the International Erasmus Prize and the Shorenstein Journalism Award, among others, and Foreign Policy magazine named him one of the world's 100 leading public intellectuals in 2010. He will talk tonight with Pankaj Mishra about Pankaj's new book, From the Ruins of Empire, The Intellectuals Who Remade Asia. Mishra is, among many other things, the author of An End to Suffering, The Buddha in the World, Temptations of the West, How to Be Modern in India, and a novel, The Romantics, which won a prize from the LA Times and was published in 11 European languages. All those books, or most of those books, are on sale afterwards, so stock up. Like Buruma, Mishra also writes regularly for many of the same publications, including the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, Bloomberg News, and in England, The Guardian, the New York New Statesman, and the Times Literary Supplement. Many of you may have seen his excellent op-ed piece in today's New York Times on America's inevitable retreat from the Middle East, in which he describes the waning of American military, diplomatic, and financial power in the Middle East and South Asia, and concludes that newly ascendant nations and people will increasingly shape events in the post-Western world. In the book we'll be hearing about tonight, Mishra looks in depth at three Asian intellectual leaders about whom most people in the West know very little, and at the ways in which their ideas shaped contemporary China, India, and the Muslim world. Just to be brief, since I want to turn everything over to them, Orhan Pamuk writes that in this brilliant book, Mishra reverses the long gaze of the West upon the East, showing modern history as it has been felt by the majority of the world's population, from Turkey to China. These are the amazing stories of the grandfathers of today's angry Asia. Excellent. Please join me in welcoming these two excellent writers and speakers, Pankaj Mishra and Ian Buruma.
Thank you for the kind introduction. So, Pankaj, here we sit as an advertisement for new spectacles. I thought I'd begin with a question about the beginning of your book, which I think quite rightly begins with the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, the first time that a non-Western country defeated a Western country, in modern history at least, or perhaps a Western country, in a war. And this is really the beginning of what I think what you see as the East sort of fighting back. But it was a very odd occasion because, I don't know if you know this, but Tolstoy described the victory of Japan against Russia as a victory for the West against the East.
Yes.
And Japan representing modern rationalism, the industrial state, the modern military, and so on, and Russia being stuck in its sort of orthodox, mystical past.
Absolutely.
And also the defeat of Russia, of course, was seen in London and in Washington as something very desirable because they hated the Russians much more than they hated the Japanese.
Yeah.
So how do you account for
No, but this is fascinating because this is how, again, it raises the question of how people perceive that particular victory from their own special perspectives. And what it means to look at that kind of history or that event from the perspective of someone who's a lawyer in South Africa, suffering all kinds of discrimination at the hands of the white majority there. And I'm thinking of Gandhi in this instance, someone like Ataturk, who's looking at this victory from the perspective of Damascus, or Nehru, who's a public school boy exposed to all kinds of indignities, as an Anglo-Indian boy would be at school in 1905 in the UK. So what they see really is Japan having mastered the sort of the secrets of European power and turning them against a European country. They're not thinking of Russia in the same way as Tolstoy is. They're thinking of Russia as a European power. And basically saying, here is a white country, essentially, that claims to belong to, that belongs to Europe in many ways. And here is Japan defeating it. And how can we learn this particular lesson, which is the lesson of a country very quickly, after being bullied out of its isolation, reconstituting itself as a modern nation state, and to the point where it can defeat China in 1895, and now it can defeat Russia in 1905. So it's just, I think it's another instance of how you can draw particular lessons from a historical event without knowing everything about it, without knowing all the details about how the Russians saw it, what Russia actually was. And you're absolutely right. Russia was not a European power in that sense, but it's the perception that matters, and it's perceptions that often shapes history.
Yeah, unfortunately, in history, countries usually learn the wrong lessons.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you think of what Asia took over, and Japan first and foremost, but took over from the West, they're usually the worst ideas. Social Darwinism, which you point out in your book, forms of Stalinism, and so on. Yeah. But even the way, the kind of liberation, ideas of liberating themselves from Western colonial power were often, it seems, borrowed from the West. And if you think, first of all, you describe Mao's revolution, but also Pol Pot in Cambodia, how often they pick these half-baked ideas up in places like Paris. Yeah. And the victims are usually other Asians. It's not fighting the West. It's a kind of rage against their own people.
Exactly. Well, someone like Tagore, who I use throughout the book to mount this particular critique of Japanese imperialism, of what Japan has turned into, and he lives long enough to witness the depredations of Japan in Asia, and how this kind of mimic imperialism or mimic nationalism turns, essentially absolutely destructive for large parts of Asia. I mean, I think if he had lived longer, he would have also seen the kind of destruction wrought by various other ideologies, half-baked ideologies imported from the West. But I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that the borrowing of these ideas from the West was not happening in a vacuum. There were a lot of pressures under which Japan was modernizing itself. There were a lot of pressures under which China was forced to modernize itself and to reconstitute itself as a nation state, simply in order to survive. And the people I write about, Liang Chichao, they're so concerned with this idea of China's survival in this dog-eat-dog world of international relations. I mean, social Darwinism is a bad idea, but it also matches the particular geopolitical reality they are inhabiting. Soon after the Boxer Rising, you see how China, just about anyone, can get into the action. And even Italy tries to get into the action and get a slice of the Chinese melon. So they are witnessing the sort of humiliation of these societies unprecedentedly, and thinking, well, what can we do? And they end up embracing these half-baked ideas because they seem like the right way forward. And they are bad ideas. And this is the tragic arc, in many ways, of the history of modern Asia. It's still working itself out.
But isn't there something slightly mechanistic about seeing modern history in terms of you had this Asia, this Eastern world with its own coherent cultures that were sort of still untouched by a lot of these bad ideas, and then comes the big bad West, and in the response to that, you get all these tragedies. To what extent, first of all, the idea of the untouched cultures cannot be right, because there is no such thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
And also, what goes along with that idea, and you see that in a lot of forms of nationalism in Asia, is this notion of we were so peaceful, not only spiritual, but peaceful. And the dog-eat-dog world is something that was imported from the West, power politics, invasions, using military bullying, and so on. But that, again, is not quite right, because Asian history itself is full of that kind of thing. So to what extent is the challenge from Western colonialism different from, let's say, the influence of Islam coming from Arabia in previous centuries, or the Mughal invasion of India, and so on? I mean, India wasn't, before the Mughals came, wasn't unblemished or untouched or somehow...
I think the modern imperialism, primarily a European creation, was unprecedented in the kind of power it accumulated, in the kind of resources it had at its disposal. both in terms of the kind of innovations of the Industrial Revolution, combined with capitalism, industrial capitalism, combined with certain idea of the good life of the individual, of the sovereign individual, of the self-seeking individual, which altogether fused to create this formidable power. I mean, the Mughals were there and they settled. There was no real sort of Mughal invasion of India, as it were. They came in sort of different. They came in waves and they settled and they absorbed. They stayed there and they embraced the local cultures. New syncretic cultures were created, but this was something different altogether. European imperialisms in places like Java or various parts of, wherever in all the coastal areas they settled. Initially, there was a bit of mingling going on, but then again, very soon there were racial hierarchies in place all through the 19th century. Just about every Asian person at that time in the late 19th century, whether in the Muslim world or in India or China, attests to this feeling of racial humiliation and the fact that they feel themselves so vulnerable against a power that can import Indian soldiers all the way from Bihar or UP to fight in the Opium Wars. They can get Chinese coolies from China and transport them all the way to the Caribbean. None of the previous empires. Obviously, there's a lot of romanticization in the anti-colonialist accounts and the nationalist accounts of the previous histories. But the fact is that modern imperialism really did constitute a kind of power that had not been witnessed before. None of the previous empires, the Ottoman or the Qing, or certainly not the Romans, had that, and they did not control territories. They did not occupy territories in quite the same way. What the British did in India, creating this infrastructure, creating the railway network, using that to expedite the exploitation of India. People didn't really have those kinds of resources because they didn't have access to.
In terms of scale, that's true. But if you think of the Islamization of large parts of the Middle East, which of course it's a smaller area, but still a huge area, had an enormous impact on cultures, and cultures did disappear as a consequence. And in fact, in terms of racial hierarchy, our great hero, our mutual great hero, Neeraj C. Chowdhury, wrote this book, and I can't remember, The Continent of Xerxes.
Absolutely, yeah.
And his thesis, which was an eccentric thesis, it must be admitted,
Deeply
but was
eccentric.
that the sort of Persian-speaking people from the north, the Aryans, came to India, and there was a racial hierarchy. To that extent, he's probably right, in that the lighter-skinned Persians, people who looked like Salman Rushdie, in fact, was the new upper class.
That's alarming.
And the sort of the darker people in what he calls the aboriginals in the rest of India certainly were of a lower rank than the invaders.
Right, but mind you, the same person also complained, the person who said that everything good within me was quickened by the British Empire, he complained bitterly about his racial humiliation in Calcutta as a student, and then even afterwards. So there was definitely that sense. I think it's possible to go back and look at many instances of people being forced to convert. And obviously, again, the Islamization of Middle East happened over several centuries. It wasn't as...
It was slower. Sure.
It did not, again, involve that kind of large scale. But it's a question of scale, really. And, traits like human violence, self-deception, greed, they've been with us for a very long time, but there's something really unique about how they get magnified and amplified in the scale that we see in the 19th century and 20th, where you have institutions, in a way, institutionalized greed, institutionalized rapacity, where entire societies are devastated very, very quickly. Older crafts, older industries completely hollowed out in large places like India or Turkey or Egypt. And fortunes, people, agrarian societies, subsistence economies, suddenly being forced to grow, cash crops for export to some other part of the world that they've never heard of. Some people getting rich for a little while, like in Egypt, on growing cotton, and then suddenly being exposed to the international markets, and you have nothing to.
Well, that's of course true, but the same thing happened, of course, in the Western world. This
Absolutely.
is not just something that was imposed.
Yeah.
But reading your book, what wasn't always clear to me was to what extent you go along with the ideas that you describe. For example, one idea which I find very interesting, which is a common idea, is this notion of the West being like a machine, efficient, industrial, ruthless, dedicated to material prosperity and so on, but without a real heart, without a spirit, whereas the East is the world of the spirit and humanity and so on. Yeah. Well, A, I'd like to know to what extent you think this is a valid distinction. B, again, it's an idea, of course, that came from the West itself.
Yes.
Because that was what the Slavophiles in Russia believed. It's German Romanticism is full of that kind of language, and Pan-Islamism and Pan-Arabism and Pan-Asianism, again, was linked to Pan-Germanism and so on.
But even someone like Alexander Herzen was talking about that. So there was, it was a shared critique of a certain kind of bourgeois commercial civilization that had appeared in the West, and some of those ideas may have been borrowed from the West, but some of those ideas were also indigenous to these societies. The fact when they compared their own societies, which had remained at more or less the same level for a long time, where they hadn't gone out and conquered different lands. They had the option to do that, and they had sometimes the resources to do that, but they hadn't done it. And here they were faced with people who had traveled thousands of miles away and living completely isolated places and working very hard. This was a very peculiar sight for a lot of people.
Well, but actually some of them had done it. Japan in the 17th century had a strongly developed commercial culture with stock exchanges and that kind of thing, and did invade Korea and parts of China, and with a kind of brutality that at that time.
But only their neighbors. They hadn't gone all the way to the other side of the world.
But then again, we're talking about scale then.
Again, this is, we keep coming back to that. This was unexampled scale, that this was on a scale that we had never seen before. And that's why people were forced into this very romantic position sometimes about thinking about their own societies in these kind of in these sort of romantic ways, and being forced to confront something new had appeared in the world. And it's not just these people, but also, as you point out, any number of people in Russia confronted with that went back to romanticizing the peasant commune. Even someone as intelligent and enlightened as Alexander Herzen, after his own infatuation with bourgeois democracy and with the idea of revolution, goes back, retreats into these romantic notions about the Russian peasant.
Or Solzhenitsyn.
And exactly, and someone like Solzhenitsyn in our own time. So we see that oscillation all the time, and even sometimes within a single career, you see people attracted and then recoiling and going back, and it's all happening, I think, in a particular political context in which people, someone like Liang Qichao, who grows up as a great admirer of Western liberal democracy, and then he sees America, he witnesses that, he sees the growing inequalities here, he sees the racial segregation here, he sees the slaughter of the First World War. And sure enough, he becomes disillusioned with the state of Europe. And I think one has to grant him that particular perception. He may have borrowed that from the European Romantics. He may have borrowed that from the European modernists and might have participated in that whole moment of lament after the First World War. But the fact is, it does grow out of a particular experience of the world. So ideas can travel, but ideas also have a context, a political context.
But there is also a sort of counter idea, which gets mixed up in all this. On one hand, you have the notion the West is a machine, it's materialistic, and so on and so forth. The other idea, which I find fascinating in your book, is and I think you mention, what was it? I think I wrote it down. I don't know what this is. Where was it? Yes, the Ali Ahmed, and who admired Israel as a community bound by religion, as though the state for the Jews, that what the Jews has in common was religious belief, which of course was a misunderstanding of Israel, because most of the early...
Israel back then, perhaps.
Certainly of Israel back then, yeah. But there is a similar misunderstanding that you see in other parts, again, on the parts of Asia I know best. One of the responses in the 17th and 18th, well, 18th and 19th, really, century of some Japanese nativists and nationalists who were faced exactly with the problems that you describe, of this overwhelming force of Western imperialism. What do we do about it? We've seen how China was defeated in the Opium War. We have to avoid this at all costs. Now, they started to analyze what they thought the source of European power was. And one of the conclusions was empire, so they needed their own empire. The other conclusion was it's Christianity. Christianity is the national religion, they thought, and that bound people together, made people obedient to their rulers, and this explains their power. So they had to then come up with their own form of a state religion. Now, that doesn't sit entirely logically with the idea of the machine that only is interested in material expansion and so on. This means that they have a faith and we don't. And indeed, that is, of course, a total misrepresentation. But they may have been right that what was dangerous about the West, and maybe still is not the materialism. It's the missionary zeal. It's the idea of we are universal civilization, and we're going to impose it on the rest of the world because it's good for them.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree with that. But going back to the point about religion, I think it was more than the idea of faith. The idea of faith as a form of political solidarity. The fact that faith can provide a coherence to otherwise scattered individuals who need to be mobilized urgently into coherent citizens of a nation state with a very clear identity. I think that's what attracted not just people in Japan, or indeed the Iranian intellectual you mentioned, also people in India, as we know. In Sri Lanka, Angakarika Dharampal, who thought Buddhism could learn a few things from Christianity and we could homogenize it a bit. In India, we see the legacy of that attempt in the Hindu nationalist movement, the whole attempt to turn Hinduism into a form of, make it resemble Christianity and Islam a bit more, because these guys were under the illusion that it's only because of Christianity, the kind of shared identity that the Europeans because of that, the Europeans work so closely together, and how they manage to organize themselves. And this is the secret that we need to learn, that we need to also
slaughter each other.
That we need to mobilize around this sort of shared religious identity. So this was a very powerful idea, and we think of Islam in that context, and sometimes we only think of Islam in that context. But this kind of hardening of political identity was happening, and was happening much faster in India than in the Muslim world in the late 19th century. And then, of course, it picks up in the Muslim world in the early 20th century, the hardening of political Islam, the idea of Islam as a religious and political solidarity. But it actually first starts happening in India. Even in Sri Lanka, it happens much, much faster. And of course, Japan is the leader in that regard.
But there was a chapter, I think, in Nehru's The Story of India, where I think it was in that book, where he expresses great admiration for China. Remember?
Yes.
And he contrasts China to India, and he says in India it doesn't really hang together, and there's a sort of envy of what he sees, again based often on misrepresentation. Absolutely. But an envy of China, because China is a real state where people feel that they are all in the same thing and so on. What was that based on?
Well, there were a lot of people at that time had this sort of envy of China as a much more coherent civilization with continuous traditions that had been around, in their perception at least, for centuries and centuries, the tradition of an imperial state that people felt loyal to and attached to. And when they looked at themselves, they found a completely incoherent national community, or no national community whatsoever. So there was this idea that if you were a politician, if you were a member of the first generation of anti-colonial activists, then you sort of despaired at this idea of bringing all these different ethnicities, different religions together on an anti-colonialist platform. And that's where a country like China became an object of envy. And the obverse of that is when, of course, Tagore goes to China. He's treated with utter contempt by a lot of Chinese, and indeed in Japan, because he's seen as coming from a completely pathetic country, which is so incoherent and has managed to let itself be completely overwhelmed by British imperialists, let itself be physically occupied. I mean, China's being given a hard time, but it's not physically occupied, at least, apart from the coastal areas, the foreigners are not a major presence in the hinterland. But so there was this idea too that India is a really lost case because it doesn't respect itself enough. There are no continuous tradition. And in fact, funny enough, I still find that attitude in a lot of Chinese writers and intellectuals. And when they go to India, they kind of recoil from what they see as a slightly incoherent, unsettled society.
Well, racism is not unique to the West.
No.
But the other thing about that, because there was this obsession in the 19th century of having sort of states that cohered and communities that have to become homogenous and so on and so forth. You say in your last chapter, which is a rather bleak chapter, and I like the darkness of it. I mean, that you don't end it up on some Pollyannish note. But
Lee Kuan Yew mode.
yeah, but the point that Pankaj makes in the last chapter, for those who haven't yet read the book, is that yes, countries like India and China and Brazil and so on are coming up. The relative influence of the United States and the West will diminish. This in some ways is a revenge, and it's a successful revenge, at least in material terms. But the East or Asia has not come up with a sort of counter-universalist idea. Why do you want a universalist idea? Hasn't universalism done enough damage already?
It has. You could argue that very convincingly. In fact, the rest of the book is a demonstration of the dangers of having that kind of missionary zeal and that kind of universalist. But don't you think we actually need a universalist idea, that we need a massive shift in our perceptions?
Well, if you're a devout Christian, you would think.
Well, I think even if you're thinking about, just 2 weeks back or 3 weeks back, the polar ice caps, we received the news of that. When we think about 2.6 billion people being told by the ruling elites in India and China that you are now going to be enjoying, at some point at least in the distant future, the consumer lifestyles that are currently being enjoyed by a few 100 million Europeans and Americans. We don't have the resources to sustain that kind of fantasy.
True, but are you then arguing that what we need is some kind of religious or spiritual, universal spiritual revival that can make people
I think much more modestly, new forms of thinking that we can all, in a way benefit. I mean, this, like people like Robert Skidelsky now talking about, how we need to rethink our economies, our ideas of happiness, our ideas of what does economic growth mean, do they, what do they mean in sort of even both in developed economies and emerging economies. I do think we need different ideas about how to think about economic development, for instance. I mean, you have millions of people being forced to move from rural areas into these Indian cities which cannot accommodate them, which are falling apart at the seams. You have a massive migration that has already occurred in China. How are we going to turn these people or realize their particular vision, which is the visions of the ruling elites of these countries?
No, I agree with that.
I mean, in that sense, we do need new ideas, and ideas that are actually, in some sense, universally applicable, and ideas about, how do we make, for instance, in a country like India, I can only speak more intimately about that. I mean, how do we make rural life viable? This is not a romantic idea, because rural life is viable for a lot of people and can be made viable. They don't all have to go and work in factories and go and work for Google in Bombay, or drink Coca-Cola.
Well, if they're lucky, they get to work for.
Well, exactly, exactly.
But yes, I could see why there's a need to find solutions to very, very serious practical problems. But I have a problem when it becomes a sort of a search for universalist ideas, because that does somehow suggest that there has to be some overriding notion which has an answer to the problems of what constitutes happiness and so on. And that does get into a religious domain.
I agree, yeah.
So
yeah.
The other thing that just to sort of, keep the conversation interesting, I could sit here and just praise your book, but isn't there a tendency perhaps to sometimes overemphasize the sort of racial aspects of various antagonisms, fears, and so on? First of all, I would take issue with the description of the EU's rejection of Turkey as what you say is an obviously, I wrote it down, racialist, What did you say?
Mm-hmm.
You probably know it
Racially
without me
motivated.
having...
We've listened. Have you
wait a
listened
minute.
to Sarkozy's speeches on that?
Yeah, well, no,
subject?
but Sarkozy maybe, but he's not in power anymore. Explicitly racially motivated. There are many reasons why having Turkey in the EU, I mean, I'm in favor of it,
Right.
but having Turkey in the EU is a problem. There is a problem of human rights. There's a problem that Turkey would be the largest member of the EU, meaning that the Germans would be afraid that there would be massive labor migration to Germany. There is indeed a problem that still many Turkish Muslims who, and I agree with you there, that it's a good thing that they have found a political voice, but have views that are very, very different on gender relations and so on than the mainstream in Europe. So that there is a certain hesitation to make Turkey into a full member is not just obviously racially motivated.
No, there are obviously other factors, but I think a lot of these arguments are phrased. A lot of the disagreements or a lot of the ideas about why Turkey should not be admitted into the EU, often they are deeply racially coded. Just as the ideas about the transatlantic alliance, there's a lot of that kind of racial encoding going on all the time. The sort of dog whistles being blown. And people are not being explicit about that, but it's very explicit to the Turks themselves often. I mean, they complain about this all the time. For them, it's very much a racially motivated refusal, and
racially
also,
or culturally, or
well, religiously too. I mean, people have gone on record saying that Islamic Turkey doesn't belong in Christian Europe, and these are people who claim to be heirs of the secular Enlightenment, who suddenly describe themselves as members of or belonging to predominantly Christian country.
But that's not necessarily racial. That's like when, in the days that in the US people said we can't possibly have a Catholic president. That wasn't racist.
Yeah, but I think there is, I mean, those messages, when people talk about immigration in countries like England and France today, I mean, those messages are being transmitted all the time. One can choose to ignore them and to see.
Yeah, no, there is that aspect, and of course you can't deny it. But I mean, again, and this is very much linked to this, where you categorize the resentments that are there in the West at the moment, and especially the United States, because of fear that the influence of the United States is waning. Fear of economic decline and so on. And this is leading to a kind of racial paranoia against non-Western people, particularly Muslims. Now, there is that, but there is another way of looking at this, which is worldwide, which is that there is an enormous populist backlash against the elites. And it's very interesting to see how in Western Europe right now, the same people who are going on and on about the Muslim danger and how Islam was a great danger to Western civilization and so on, some of our best friends have been saying this kind of thing, are now using exactly the same rhetoric against Europe. Nobody talks about, in my native country, in the Netherlands, the populist parties are no longer talking about Muslims. That's yesterday's issue. Today it's Europe. And for exactly the same reason, because Europe, as well as immigration and Muslim immigration, was blamed on these liberal elites who've forced this down our throats. Just as in the United States, you have exactly the same thing among Tea Party people. The liberal elites have forced civil rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so to simply see it as racial antagonism or xenophobia, I think is perhaps slightly missing the point.
Yeah, but one is not exclusively seeing it in those terms. I mean, the Republican campaign in the last few weeks and even before that, it's been very clear that racial buttons are being pressed, those hot buttons are being pressed all the time, and those dog whistles are being blown. So one can interpret it as a backlash against the liberal elites. I mean, that discourse has also been around for a long time. But there's no doubting the fact that is also happening. And that is a major part of this sort of paranoia about the demographic transformation of this country that's happening, and the fear that we are now increasingly in a minority. That's a very potent fear, and they're playing on that all the time. We can't downplay that.
And that's why Obama is so hated, because he's both non-white and clearly a member of the elite.
Absolutely.
Unlike Mr. Romney, who pulled himself up by his bootstraps. Okay, I think we've chatted enough. So who would like to ask a question? And you have to go up to one of the two microphones. Stunned silences. So,
yeah, since we've been talking about China a little bit, I'm wondering about what you feel about this fellow Mao Zedong, who looks like he was able to take a European-dominated country and bring them not only into the 20th century, but into possibly the 21st and 22nd century. Are the Chinese more accepting of him after the Cultural Revolution than they were? Do they now think of him again as a hero? Is this something which we should begin to appreciate as the major change happening today?
who are you asking?
Both wonderful intellectuals.
You should go first, yeah.
Well, I certainly hope not. I mean, not that we're not intellectuals, but Mao Zedong is going to last until the 22nd century. Well, I think he's an example of how if you kill one person, you go to jail. If you kill 30 million, you're a great man. And you do see in Chinese taxis and so on often a little Mao idol dangling from the mirror because he's become a kind of godlike figure like other great generals and so on in Chinese history. But I don't think most Chinese admire him greatly. I think there is the official line is he did 70% good and 30% bad. I think most people know slightly better. But in the demonstrations, recent demonstrations against Japan over these rocks in the China Sea, which have whipped up a lot of nationalist fervor, it is interesting that a lot of people are carrying pictures of Mao. And that's nothing to do with anti-Japanese sentiments. It's everything to do with the sentiments against the Chinese government. It means you're weak, you're not standing up to foreign powers. We need a great killer like Mao to put us together again and so on. And that fits Pankaj's analysis absolutely perfectly.
I think that's answered it.
I had a couple comments, and unfortunately for Mr. Buruma, I tend to side with Mr. Mishra. But the first one was about the, you're talking about the sheer scale and the breadth of Western imperialism and the sort of like upheaval that it caused in Asia. And I was just thinking about how it's hard to cast a gaze over sort of like panoramic view over 3,000-4,000 years of history, but and of course there's been invasions and wars and colonialism and domination amongst Asian nations, from the Mongols to the Mataram Empire in Java or the Khmer Empire, and even within China, because a lot of people think China is just one civilization, and in some ways it's not. It's been several kingdoms battling each other. But I think that within that sort of like the period that you're talking about, in the 18th century, the sheer scale, the upheaval that Western colonialism imposed on half of the world was unprecedented. I mean, just to give like small examples of what had happened before, and these are both kind of like maritime examples, but Indonesian sailors and fishermen have been known to trade into northern Australia with the Aborigine people, but they never stayed, and even in...
What is your question?
That was just that was my comment about that thing. And even within, Chinese history, the eunuch Zheng He commanded an enormous armada that traveled all over the Indian Ocean and East Africa, but they never stayed, and they never caused a kind of, upheaval and dominance that was there. And my second comment was about Turkey, and I do believe that it is primarily a very racist and Islamophobic attitude from the European Union. I think that it's clear to me in some ways that Serbia might become a member of the European Union even before Turkey, which is incredible since Serbia was an instigator of genocide in this century in Europe. But I think for many Europeans that doesn't matter to them. So that's
Okay, thank you very much.
It was mentioned that you had the op-ed piece in today's Times, and I don't know if you've read it, but Max Boot responded to it on commentary online already, and exposes your shallow arguments and your anti-American stance. But he brings up an interesting point. It seems to me that you talk about the American retreat from Southeast Asia, beginning with the debacle in 1975 in Vietnam. And he more or less says this has been a disaster for the people of Southeast Asia, beginning with the Vietnamese people, that Ho Chi Minh and his successors won. And then he goes on to more or less say, if America retreated from the Middle East, it would be a disaster for the people of the Middle East. What would you say about the people of Asia?
I've heard about this Max Boot piece, and I looked it up, and I read the first line, where it identified me as an Anglo-Indian writer, thereby setting high standards of accuracy and fairness, and I did not read it further. I think we can forget about Max Boot here.
Okay, so I kind of have, it's basically one question, but it has two forks. So Ian, you were talking earlier about the conclusion to this book, about how Pankaj seems to be advocating a sort of universalism as a solution to this, well, universalism, but a different kind, right? And I was thinking that we have a world economy, but we don't really have a world history or even world literature. And I was wondering, Pankaj, if you felt your work to be kind of contributing towards a movement towards a truly global history, I guess.
I don't know. I mean, I think this is a very modest attempt to...
But it is an attempt.
It is an attempt, very much so, to think about certain aspects of history, to open up certain kind of perspectives, whether it's the Russo-Japanese War, and to describe ways in which a lot of people experienced and witnessed the major sort of monuments, the major milestones of historical milestones of the last 100, 150 years, and to see how these people conceived of their place in the world and how they aspired to create a place for themselves in this larger world. But did you finish your question?
Well, the second part is kind of related, and it has to do with that. I'm kind of curious if these intellectuals that you write about, if they ever undertook any kind of study of European history or European literature as a sort of archaeology or diagnosis of the thing that hit them.
Well, they read whatever was available to them. And
right.
You have to remember, in the 1890s in China, there was hardly any translations available.
That's true.
The people I write about were the first people to be actually translating European texts of political philosophy or history into Chinese and making them then available to their Chinese counterparts. Often from Japanese. So I think the kind of institutional support, the institutional networks you needed for the production of knowledge, libraries, institutions of not just educational institutions, but all kinds of things that you need to have a coherent body of knowledge, which has been around here for such a long time, they never existed. And even today, in large countries like India and China, if you look at the state of archives there, you look at the state of intellectual production there, it's still very meager. So the idea of world history or world literature
it's still a very raw notion. It's still in the making, and I think it'll take a gigantic intellectual effort to put all these histories together, to actually even look into the archives that have not been opened for a long time.
But you think this will come to pass?
We've still got
Okay.
5 more people, so
by
perhaps
all
we can
means.
bring this to a close.
Yes, I haven't read your book yet, and what you haven't mentioned here tonight, or maybe tangentially, is the power of modern consumer culture to define the world. Seems to me that we're all defined as our happiness by the possession of this sheer amount of goods coming out of the West, produced in the East, but coming out of the West. And do you have any comments about that?
The consumer society really gets underway much later than the period that I'm describing. You know, obviously, there are goods being manufactured which a lot of people in places like India and China have never seen. But I think the whole idea of a lifestyle being defined by consumption, that's a relatively recent idea that really gets underway in the 1930s and 40s with mass production, and the United States takes the lead in that. So that happens in a period that the book really kind of rushes through. It doesn't linger on that, but that is a very important factor in the way, you know, people have set national tasks for themselves. You know, one has to remember that even the Russians tried to match the Americans and in creating a consumer economy and finally lost. But they were striving towards the same goal. I mean, Nikita Khrushchev constantly talked about how he was going to beat the Americans in creating this consumer utopia. So in that sense, it has been a hugely influential.
Richard Nixon told him the Americans had better refrigerate.
And swimming pools.
Until what time do we have?
About 10 more minutes.
Okay.
Why don't we finish the questions then?
So let's have the questioners who are now lined up. So go ahead.
First of all, I'd like to commend you for the way that you laid out the scale and scope of the way the British ruled India through the economic prism, the political prism, and the moral prism. And I loved your New York Times article as well, and it's very clear that the U.S. viewed their foreign policy through economic interests and through containment. And I think my question for you is, given the pivot towards Asia and given the rising powers of China and India and the problems they face, as well as the lack of universality, which I completely agree with you on, what form do you think the next empire will take, whoever it may be?
I sometimes regret being a pundit or even posing as one.
I'm sorry, it's a very...
I'm looking forward to when I can go back to being an ordinary person with ordinary doubts and confusions and ambivalences. I mean, I really can't answer that, to be honest, but I think there is going to be no alternative empire, that we'll have a lot of different countries asserting themselves and often probably coming into conflict with each other. But I think those days are gone where one country could dominate the rest of the planet, or even a large part of the planet, in the way the British and then the Americans did for a long time. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, that's right.
It's a question for me. It's a question for Mr. Mishra. You were one of the first, or rather early writers, intellectuals, who wrote about Kashmir, what life was like for ordinary people under the Indian security state or the Pakistani side of it. I imagine you weren't very popular with the Indian establishment when you wrote about some of those things. The last 15, 20 years. How do they feel about you now? And I ask because the last time I visited India, it was the time when Arundhati Roy was being threatened with charges of sedition because she had made a a statement that should seem obvious to a lot of people about Kashmir. So have things changed? Are your views or your narrative went against that of the mainstream Indian establishment of what the occupation was like, etc. So the general question, but have things changed?
I honestly don't know what the Indian establishment thinks of me. But I think what has happened, that there is a shift, that people have recognized, a lot of people in the establishment, not just politicians or civil servants, but also people in the media, that this is a serious problem, and the Kashmiri Muslims have not been happy for a very long time. And whatever you do doesn't work, whether it's military firepower or sort of flooding the valley with millions, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and that we need to do something else. What that thing is, nobody knows. But there is certainly a small beginning there where people are beginning to acknowledge that there is a problem there that simply cannot be solved by ignoring it or suppressing it, and also India's claim to being the serious, responsible power in the world, of having a seat at the UN Security Council. And those claims look very unpersuasive when you have this problem in your backyard, which also has a potential bleeding all over the map. One has to remember that Kashmir played such a large role in the radicalization of so much of Pakistani society, and particularly in the border areas there. So it has, very serious potential, still very serious potential, that part of the world. But I think there is certainly some progress there. There is a recognition, and there have been talks with Pakistan about that, and different ideas are in play about how to resolve, and certainly how to improve the security situation there, the human rights situation there.
Okay.
Hi. You mentioned that towards the end of your book, you talk about how current global trends are unsustainable and there needs to be a paradigm shift towards some kind of universally agreed upon principles, ways for the world to function. And it might be asking a lot, but I was wondering if you could flesh that out a little more. I assume you mean in economic terms, political terms, sustainability terms. So,
one of the great merits of his book is he never uses the phrase paradigm shift.
I honestly wish I had a blueprint for that, but I think it's very hard to come up with these kinds of universal solutions when we haven't really diagnosed the problem correctly. I mean, when you have ruling elites in countries like India and China simply sleepwalking their way through events and just thinking at some point it's all going to happen. And we are also going to fully modernize ourselves in the way modernity has achieved a kind of finished form in places like Europe and America. So there is no recognition at some point, at this point, among the government, among the intelligentsia, that this is, as to use your word, this is unsustainable. It's all about containing the violence that is created by disaffected people. The increasing instances of social unrest erupting into violence, of people who've been promised a lot by globalization, by economic liberalization, and then not getting what they want, and what they have been promised, and then erupting into this kind of political rage, the insurgency in central India, where you have people fighting off the state and multinational corporations who are now trying to dispossess them. There's so many different kinds of disaffection around the country, which is being sometimes turning into militant movements. And all people are thinking about, how do we contain this? How do we put a lid on all this? They're not thinking about, maybe we should leave these people in these forests. They've been living there for a long time. And again, one could argue that this is a romantic vision, but actually that's what they are fighting for, their right to live unmolested in these forests, and for them not to be dispossessed by the mining corporations that are coming in there. Is there a policy that acknowledges that the value of that kind of existence, or are we all, hell-bent upon modernizing just about every individual that exists in India? 1.2 billion people. Are they all going to be living in cities? So I think once we start with sort of acknowledging these problems, I think it's only then we can begin to arrive at these larger solutions. But there has to be some sort of a piecemeal movement towards it.
The last question.
That's a lot of pressure. My question is about Syria, and I would be interested to hear what both of you think, which is in a post-Cold War world that is more muddled, where imperialist and universalist ideals seem less important, what are the prospects for a situation like Syria, which is, on the one hand, very complicated, but 15 months ago it was less complicated. But yet everybody has kind of stood by. How do we deal with those situations in our new complicated world?
Well, everybody hasn't stood by. I mean, Qatar hasn't stood by, and weapons. Saudi Arabia hasn't stood by. Iran hasn't stood by. So there are a lot of players in this.
Although the Gulf countries seem to be kind of, they're doing what they can, but they're waiting for more powerful leadership on the scale of the intervention in Bosnia.
I don't know about that.
You're the pundit.
I think we are.
I'm just.
I've already resigned from that position publicly.
I mean, what is the question? Should the United States intervene or send arms and so on?
Yeah, to some degree, it's whether the U.S. should do anything, or is there anything to be done by any country?
One of the reasons I admire President Obama more than many people, including many liberals, is that I think he's played it by and large pretty right in the Middle East, and tries to stay out of military conflicts as much as he can. And I don't see in a civil war, even though it's clear that the government is a ghastly one, but in a civil war where it's very unclear who the players are, what they're doing, who's got the power, what it'll be like, and so on, to intervene militarily could, in most cases, can only make it worse. So I agree with the president that the United States should be very, very cautious. But I don't know what the pundit thinks.
I agree with you, actually.
Spoken like a true Anglo-Indian. Thank you very much.